What do you do when you realize the man you've shared a bed with for 14 years, the man whose name is on your daughter's birth certificate, doesn't actually exist? To the world, he was Arthur Sterling, heir to a banking dynasty. To the FBI, he was a ghost. But to a shallow grave in a California garden, he was a killer who had been running for 30 years. The air in San Marino, California, had a way of holding its breath. It was a town built on the quiet rustle of eucalyptus leaves and the clink of silverware against fine bone china. Into this sanctuary of old money and high hedges stepped a man who introduced himself as Elias Thorne. He didn't arrive in a cloud of dust or with the desperation of a drifter. He arrived in a taxi, wearing a navy blazer that fit him like a second skin and carrying a single battered leather suitcase that suggested a life of impoverished aristocracy. He approached the estate of Margaret Gable, a widow whose mind was beginning to fray at the edges like a well-worn rug, and offered her a smile that felt like an inheritance. "I am a researcher from the University of Munich," Elias told her, his voice a melodic blend of European precision and American warmth. "I am documenting the architectural soul of California. Your home, Mrs. Gable, is the heart of that soul." Within a week, Elias had moved into the guest house. He didn't just rent a room, he curated a presence. He spent his mornings sketching in the garden and his afternoons reading poetry aloud to Margaret on the veranda. He was a master of the mirror technique. He became whatever Margaret was missing. To her, he was the attentive grandson she never had. But to Margaret's son, David, Elias was a parasite. David was a man of concrete facts. He worked in industrial shipping, a world of manifests and weight loads. To him, Elias Thorne was a weight that didn't belong on a ship. "He's a ghost, Mom," David argued one evening in the kitchen, his voice rising over the hum of the refrigerator. "I checked with the University of Munich. They've never heard of an Elias Thorne. He doesn't have a car, he doesn't have a bank account, and I caught him looking through your desk yesterday." Margaret waved him off with a trembling hand. "He's a gentleman, David. He has private family arrangements. Not everyone lives in a world of spreadsheets." The conflict simmered until a humid Tuesday in July. David confronted Elias behind the old, vine-choked gazebo at the edge of the property. The gazebo was a relic of a different era, sinking slowly into the soft California soil. "I want you gone by tomorrow," David said, his face inches from Elias's. "I don't care what lies you fed my mother. I'm calling the police in the morning to have you gone." Elias didn't flinch. He didn't even stop pruning the rosebush he was working on. He turned slowly, the shears glinting in the fading sunlight. "David," Elias said, his voice dropping into a chilling, hollow register. "You spend your whole life moving boxes from one side of the ocean to the other. You've never realized that the most important things in life aren't moved, they're buried." That night, the neighborhood was silent, save for the rhythmic, muffled thump-thump of a shovel biting into the earth near the gazebo. The next morning, David and his wife, Sarah, were gone. Their bed was made. Their coffee pot was cold. When a panicked Margaret found Elias in the garden, he was covered in a light sheen of sweat, leaning on a spade. "They had to leave, Margaret," Elias said, taking her hands in his. His touch was cold. David was recruited for a special project. Something international. "He asked me to tell you that he's safe, but he cannot contact you. It's for the safety of the family." Margaret looked at the fresh, dark mound of earth beneath the gazebo, then back at Elias. In her grief and confusion, she chose the lie. It was easier to believe in a secret mission than a shallow grave. For the next 6 months, Elias Thorne became the master of the Gable estate. He lived in the main house now, sleeping in the guest wing but dining with Margaret every night. He had moved from researcher to protector. He began the process of financial colonization. He convinced Margaret that David's secret mission required funding that the government couldn't officially provide. One by one, her heirlooms vanished. The silver service was sent for cleaning and never returned. Her late husband's stock portfolio was liquidated into blind trusts that Elias managed from a small laptop in the library. He was meticulous. He wrote letters to Margaret, purportedly from David, using a typewriter he'd bought in a different county. Dear Mother, the work here is dangerous but vital. Elias is our only link to the outside world. Trust him with everything. We will be home soon. Margaret would sit by the window, clutching the letters and weeping, while in the backyard, Elias continued to landscape. He planted heavy, deep-rooted shrubs over the site of the gazebo. He was literally growing a garden over his crimes. But the police in San Marino weren't as easily swayed as an elderly widow. A missing persons report had been filed by Sarah's sister. When a detective showed up at the front door, Elias didn't panic. He greeted the officer with a glass of iced tea and a stack of confidential-looking documents. David is involved in a sensitive contract, Elias explained, leaning in as if sharing a state secret. I'm sure you understand the nature of non-disclosure agreements in this town. The detective was suspicious, but Elias had no criminal record because Elias Thorne didn't exist before 1985. However, the detective noticed David's truck was still in the garage. If he's on a mission, why did he leave his vehicle? The detective asked. Elias felt the first prickle of genuine fear. The mask was slipping. That night, he didn't sleep. He packed his suitcase, took the remaining cash from Margaret's safe, and stole David's truck. He drove east, leaving the Elias Thorne identity behind in the rearview mirror, buried in the same dirt as the man he had murdered. Elias spent the next 3 years as a phantom. He realized that the American highway system was the perfect place for a man with no face. He stopped being a researcher and became a consultant. He landed in Connecticut under the name Andrew Sterling. He realized that if you dressed in a tailored suit and spoke with enough condescension, people would hand you the keys to the kingdom without asking for a birth certificate. He faked a resume that claimed a PhD from Yale and a background in hedge fund management. He was hired by a mid-sized investment firm. He had no idea how to manage money, but he knew how to manage people. He spent his days in meetings, nodding solemnly and using buzzwords like synergistic volatility and asymmetric hedging. He was a brilliant actor playing the role of a brilliant businessman. But the past is a persistent hunter. One afternoon, a routine traffic check in Hartford flagged the truck he was driving, the truck that still belonged to a dead man in San Marino. Elias saw the cruiser in his mirror. He didn't pull over. He turned into a crowded shopping mall, abandoned the vehicle, and walked into a department store. He bought a new coat, a pair of glasses, and a hat. He walked out the back exit and caught a bus to New York City. Andrew Sterling was dead. It was time for someone new to be born, someone bigger. Manhattan in the early 90s was a gilded cage, and Elias Thorne, now reinvented as Arthur Sterling, had the master key. He arrived at Grand Central Station with nothing but a counterfeit confidence and a stolen watch. But within 6 months, he had convinced the Upper East Side that he was the lost branch of the Sterling banking dynasty. He didn't just tell people who he was, he performed it. He spent his days in the reading room of a New York public library, not studying history, but memorizing the social registers of the 1920s. He learned which boarding schools had the most insider nicknames and which yacht clubs had the most obscure entry requirements. The Sterling identity was his masterpiece. He claimed his wealth was tied up in a sovereign trust in the Cayman Islands, a lie that conveniently explained why he never had cash and why his name didn't appear on modern Forbes lists. The coronation happened at a charity gala for the Metropolitan Museum of Art. Arthur, dressed in a tuxedo that fit as if it had been tailored on Savile Row, found himself standing next to Eleanor Vance. Eleanor was everything Arthur wasn't. She was a high-powered corporate litigator, a woman of sharp intellect, and she was real. The Sterling name, she said, swirling her champagne, her eyes narrowing with professional curiosity. I don't recall seeing your family at the last foundation meeting. Arthur didn't blink. He gave her a tired, aristocratic smile, the look of a man burdened by too much history. My father loathed the foundation meetings. He called them accountants' circuses. We prefer to do our philanthropy privately. The sterling name is heavy enough without the press weighing it down. It was a perfect social engineering move. By acting as if he was above the prestige, he made himself the most prestigious person in the room. Within 3 months, they were engaged. The marriage was a fortress of silence. Arthur insisted on a prenuptial privacy agreement, claiming his family's lawyers required it. In reality, it was a way to ensure Eleanor never looked too closely at his non-existent assets. They lived in a sprawling townhouse on 72nd Street, funded entirely by Eleanor's massive salary. Arthur played the role of the eccentric intellectual, spending his days managing the family archives, which were actually just stacks of old newspapers he used to keep up his lies. When their daughter, Clara, was born, the stakes reached a fever pitch. Arthur became a devoted, if paranoid, stay-at-home father. He refused to let the child have a passport. He wouldn't let Eleanor take photos of him. He told her it was because of a security threat from a rival family branch. "I'm protecting us, Eleanor," he would whisper in the dark. "The sterling name attracts predators. We have to remain invisible." After 14 years, the mask began to rot. It started with a simple request. Eleanor wanted to buy a summer home in the Hamptons. "I'll handle the financing through the trust," Arthur promised. But weeks turned into months, and the paperwork never arrived. Eleanor, used to the efficiency of the legal world, began to feel a cold dread. She noticed things she had ignored for a decade. Arthur never used a credit card. He only used allowances she gave him. He never drove. He didn't have a social security number on their joint tax filings. He claimed he was a foreign national resident for tax purposes. One night, she found him in the basement, obsessively shredding a stack of old letters. "Arthur," she asked. He turned, and for a split second, the sterling polish was gone. In its place was the face of a cornered animal. The face of the man who had stood over a gazebo in California 20 years prior. "Go back upstairs, Eleanor," he said, his voice flat and terrifying. "You're digging in places you don't want to see." Eleanor didn't go back upstairs. She went to a private investigator named Silas Crane. "Find out who my husband is," she told him. "I don't care what it costs." Crane started with the Sterling family. He reached out to the actual heirs in Philadelphia. Their response was chilling. "We have no Arthur. We have never heard of him. If he's using our name, he's a criminal." Crane then did something Arthur never expected. He went to the FBI's ghost database, a collection of unidentified fingerprints from unsolved crimes. He matched a print Arthur had left on a divorce summons Eleanor had quietly filed. The result popped up in red text. "Match found. Elias Thorne. Wanted for questioning. 1985 double disappearance. San Marino, California." The end came in a frantic blur. Realizing Eleanor knew the truth, Arthur snapped. He didn't flee alone. He took Clara. He drove a rental car to a safe house in Baltimore, calling Eleanor from payphones, screaming about the Sterling legacy and betrayal. He was no longer a con artist. He was a man losing his grip on reality. The FBI tracked him to a small apartment. For 7 hours, the architect of shadows sat by a window with a gun in his hand and his daughter in his arms, telling the negotiators he was a victim of a grand political conspiracy. When the tactical team finally breached the door, they didn't find a billionaire. They found a man who looked decades older than his years, shivering in a cheap t-shirt, his sterling accent finally replaced by the panicked stutter of a drifter. The final act didn't take place in a ballroom, but in a dusty backyard in San Marino. Based on the FBI's interrogation of Elias, they returned to the old Gable property. They tore down the shrubs Elias had planted 20 years ago. They dug beneath the rotted remains of the gazebo. There, wrapped in industrial plastic, were the remains of David and Sarah. In 2013, Elias Thorne stood in a courtroom. He was no longer Arthur Sterling. He was no longer a researcher or consultant. He was prisoner number 8832. As the judge read the sentence, 27 years to life, Elias leaned over to his lawyer and whispered, "They still don't get it." I gave him a better story than the truth, showing how far out of touch of reality he was. The architect was finally behind walls he couldn't talk his way out of.